Originally released on the Genesis in 1991, Streets of Rage was Sega's response to the still burgeoning popularity of side-scrolling arcade-style beat-em-ups. Capcom's Final Fight was the game to emulate at the time. In a lot of ways, Streets of Rage felt like little more than a Final Fight also ran, right down to its 3 playable characters and comic book gritty urban setting. Now that Streets of Rage has arrived on the Wii Virtual Console, you can be reminded of the great music, though the beat-em-up gameplay doesn't hold up quite as well. In Streets of Rage, you play as one of 3 ex-cops: Alex Hunter, Axel Stone, or Blaze Fielding, who are determined to clean up the apparently rage-filled streets of their fair city. As was the fashion of the time, they'll exact their brand of vigilante justice by walking to the right and brutalizing anyone that crosses their path. The 3 characters feel ever so slightly different, though the basic controls are the same, giving you a jump button and a single attack button, which, depending on the context, can be used to dish out a few different types of attack combos. You can also walk up to an enemy and automatically grapple them, and from there you can pull off moves like shoulder throws and suplexes. Enemies can also grapple you, though it's easy to get out of, and if you do end up getting thrown, a well-timed tap of the jump button will have you landing on your feet like some kind of bare-knuckle cat. There's also a cooperative angle to the grappling in the 2-player game, as players can toss each other at enemies as a high-powered ranged attack. You can also call in for backup, which comes in the form of some heavy artillery launched by a sleek-looking police cruiser sitting several screens away. It's great for dealing with large crowds and especially obnoxious bosses, and it's one of those things that defines Streets of Rage. Also, accidentally calling in for backup at the very start of the game, assuming that the button you're pressing will produce an attack or a jump, is truly one of those hallmark Streets of Rage moments. The novelty of the police backup and the grappling business help stave off some of the monotony inherent to most beat-em-ups, if at least for a little while. Still, for what it is, Streets of Rage is a pretty well-made beat-em-up. It's not a bad-looking game, with plenty of changes of scenery, parallax scrolling backgrounds, and good-for-their-time animations, though it's hard not to be bothered by the pervasive palette swaps you'll see in the enemies you'll face. Really, the saving grace for Streets of Rage is the music, which is varied and catchy, and it makes good use of the Genesis sound synthesizer. This was really some of the best music to be heard on the Genesis at its time, and the actual compositions stand up rather well. It's not quite as catchy or intricate as what would end up appearing in Streets of Rage 2, but for some folks, the music will be worth the price of admission here. It's tough to get excited about side-scrolling beat-em-ups in 2007. The standards for depth in a fighting system, regardless the genre, have been raised to the point that actually playing Streets of Rage is just boring. There's no denying the quality of the soundtrack, but at 800 Wii points, it's a tough game to wholeheartedly recommend to anyone who doesn't already have built-in nostalgia for Streets of Rage. Streets of Rage was developed around a traditional beat-em-up style with a 3D plane, using various attacks and fighting hordes of enemies. There are additional weapons found through each level, and the player obtains them either by smashing props or are dropped from enemies. The layout is still comfortable, allowing you to jump in with ease just like in Final Fight and Double Dragon. However, Streets of Rage excelled better than Double Dragon and even outperformed the Super NES port of Final Fight. I always felt that way towards the series, considering it was progressing the genre and not staying in its niche. Unlike Capcom's Super NES port, SR had a 2-player function which should always be included. Capcom pulling a Technos Japan on Final Fight is truly puzzling, while Sega understood this better than them. It's important because a game like this is something you should experience with other players as a team to defeat waves of bad guys. What adds to the two-player mode is using your partner to perform tag team attacks to take out enemies. I was only able to come across a couple of them, with one being to jump off the other to perform a flying kick. That is what two-player action is all about, and not even early games in the 80s did something of this caliber. As for the characters, they too have strengths and weaknesses which actually balances the gameplay. That's especially true for the two-player mode, as you could have Axel and Adam as a power team. Or swap out one of them with Blaze for both speed and strength. There is also a special attack where a cop car will pull up behind the players to shoot a rocket or a barrage of bullets down on the enemies. Any common bad guys on the screen will get killed instantly, but the bosses will only take significant damage. That power-up really helped in most boss battles, considering how cheap a few of them were, aka the twin sisters. There are up to 4 difficulties to pick from, but the difference is you fight more enemies and take on 2 bosses per level. A surprising feature is probably at the end of level 8 when facing Mr. X, as you can become his personal henchman. There isn't one beat 'em up that comes to mind with having a feature to let the players have an alternate ending. Sega went the extra mile here over its competitors in many ways. Another plus is the good frame rate thanks to the Genesis hardware running 7.67 MHz, that is much better compared to most Super NES titles like Super Double Dragon with its lower frame rate. It is always great for any game to run at a better FPS than most people think. Of course, there are some problems within this area of the game. For starters, most of the bosses have cheap attacks they constantly do until the battle is over. The wrestler and the twin female ninja bosses would do the same attack repeatedly, of either charging or constantly flipping. Even coming close to the twin female ninjas would always lead to me getting thrown instantly. It was a problem with these older titles back then, with the typical designers versus players mentality. The level design could have also been taken further other than following a straight path. Take Double Dragon 2 for example, as the level design leads you to different areas of the same level. There weren't even transitional areas as seen in others, and looking at the same scenery repeatedly gets boring. Sega eventually fixes these in the sequels, since the designers don't always get it right in most first entries. As far as I am aware, there really was no brawler that had a unique style to its presentation. It would have a straight-up theme like Marion getting captured in Double Dragon, as that was all the players needed to understand. However, Sega would add its unique style for the presentation that most, not even Super Double Dragon, weren't even doing in 1991. It starts with a starlight city at night as the screen pans, just with an underground-style song. Then the theme is slowly explained in a scrolling text about the events of the game. That blows what Final Fight or Double Dragon could even do, and you can tell Sega took notes of the pop culture of the early 90s. The theme was a step in the right direction for the genre too, since you were not saving a damsel in distress from a gang leader. Meaning, the woman protagonist was doing more than being a cliché plot device, with Blaze Fielding sharing the spotlight. Others like Bad Dudes didn't revolve around this concept either. However, was there any main female protagonist helping the male characters in saving the president? Of course not, and this game took it further for playing a strong female fighter that also wasn't sexualized. The visuals were a nice step up for most Genesis games containing animated backgrounds that capture the mood. The little details such as the second level with the wind blowing across the screen and the worn-out poster's edges flapping looked excellent. It creates a sense of tension considering the type of mood this environment would have during the late hours at night on the streets. The parallax effect also had good effort and easily surpassed anything the others were doing that year. The third stage was the finest example of this, with at least 3 separate backgrounds overlapping the other. As for the sprites, they weren't broad like in Final Fight, but they were still rendered with their own good style. Even their animation has good rendering, as seen with Blaze brushing her hair to the side if you don't move. The soundtrack was truly fantastic because of the stylish underground tones designed by Yuzo Koshiro. The songs, especially during the boss fights, always engaged me while fighting off Mr. X's goons. Honestly, the boss theme had a calm sound, but it also had a menacing tone as the loud beats gave the feeling you were fighting a powerful enemy. The first stage gave an upbeat theme because of the downtown area, while in level 2 would have an eerie and tense tone due to the isolated streets from the late evening. The level's songs contributed to their environments, giving variety to the soundtrack. Similar to the original Sonic, SR does share problems that plagued the pack in-game. We begin with the detail on the sprites having some choppiness around the edges, and Sega probably was still learning the hardware. However, I'm convinced they could have fixed that, as the sprites hardly had any smoothness on them. It's hard to compare when the ones in Final Fight or even Super Double Dragon had smoother details. They also should have made the characters a little bigger so it can add broadness to their forms. The sound effects needed work as well, which is surprising when the music was designed by Yuzo Koshiro. They sounded weak, such as the fire-breathing boss who acted like he was making farts from his mouth rather than blowing fire. In fact, most of these effects was as if someone was making them from their mouths too. The animation also needed some work because the bosses were a little stiff with their movements. Each one always had to stop for 2 seconds before the enemies would continue their routine animations. Despite some issues, SR still presents a unique soundtrack with colorful environments to make up for its shortcomings. In terms of content, SOR is on par with rest of the genre, providing some replay value. The content includes a 2-player mode, different character playthroughs and 4 difficulty settings. There are about 8 levels with no transitions from small areas to another. Out of most titles, the content had good development, especially with the 2-player mode in that year. The characters having strengths and weaknesses is really a plus that ensures there are 3 ways to experience the gameplay. You can also see the same thing for the multiplayer to help mix and match a team. The content is certainly better than Final Fight on the Super NES, but I couldn't help to think Sega should have done more. The original Double Dragon on NES with its Mode B acted like a mini fighting game. It's not needed for SR, but that would have given us more features to play around with. Sega could even improve on that feature by putting in 1 to 2 rounds as a secondary multiplayer mode. It doesn't need to act like the same style from Street Fighter 2, but something a little close to this arcade classic would have been awesome. SR seems to have gotten many things right compared to its competition in 1991. SR was a great addition to the Genesis library thanks to Sega's experience with developing around the arcade system. The gameplay had similar features to the competition, but the characters having strengths and weaknesses gave it an edge. Even the 2-player mode was designed well for this feature, so you can mix and match the characters as a team. The graphics saw the same quality design as the original Sonic by showcasing the power the Genesis could do with its little details and parallaxing. The theme isn't the most original, but it was executed a lot better than most, as no damsel needed rescuing. While it is true that Samus from Metroid started the trend for badass women to take a major role, Blaze continued an important representation. Yuzo Koshiro's Magic created a classic soundtrack that provided the perfect moods for each level. It might not be his best work, but damn did each track hit the right tones for those moments. The replay value is also pretty high between the multiplayer, different characters to choose and 4 difficulty modes. The game does have its shortcomings, but the pros outweigh those issues.